Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to everybody to this last interactive webinar as part of our knowledge sharing forum on strengthening systems learning for MoE leadership in crisis settings. And this webinar has been made possible thanks to the generous financial support of the European Commission Service for Foreign Policy Instruments. I see that some people are still joining, so maybe we wait for a few seconds. Okay, so if you have participated in the first webinar that was last week, and in the second webinar that was earlier this week, you have heard that during the first online roundtable about using a systems approach to strengthen MoE leadership in crisis settings. And during the second webinar last Monday, you've heard about strengthening system capacities for Ministry of Education leadership in crisis settings. And so the topic of today's webinar is strengthening systems learning for MoE leadership in crisis settings. And more specifically, what we hope to cover in today's session is to provide some brief introduction to some of the key concepts to understand systems learning in order to strengthen MoE leadership in crisis settings, and to collectively reflect and discuss with you about how we can enhance systems learning across all levels of the Ministry of Education during and after crises based on relevant country experiences. So we are really going to rely on your thoughts and ideas coming from your respective country experiences. So before delving into the heart of the topic, just a few words on the format of the webinar. We'll start by introducing some of the key concepts of systems learning and what we mean by that, because we know that it's not necessarily clear to everyone. And then for approximately an hour, in order to better understand how systems learning can effectively take place, we'll hear from our speakers today that include ministry representatives, researchers, and partners on their own perspective related to systems learning. And we'll have first very short presentations on how our speakers engage with MoE leadership in crisis in their work. And then we'll move on to a two-part moderated discussion. And then during the second half of the webinar, so after the panel discussion, we will offer the opportunity to all participants to discuss in depth all these different issues related to systems learning and MoE leadership. So we will split across smaller breakout groups for approximately 45 minutes, and you will all have the opportunity to share your thoughts, your experience, your ideas about strengthening systems learning for MoE leadership. So today we are very pleased to have with us 4 great experts who will share their insights and their experiences about this issue of systems learning and MoE leadership in crisis settings. So first we have Dr. Moiza Binat Sawar, who is a research fellow working on equity and social policy at ODI Global. Dr. Sawar notably focuses on the political economy of the design, implementation, and delivery of education for populations that have been historically marginalized from public service access. We are also lucky to have with us George Moga, who is the Director General for Planning and Budgeting at the Ministry of General Education and Instruction in South Sudan. We are also pleased to welcome Nicola, who works as Deputy Global Education Cluster Coordinator for the Global Education Cluster. And Nicola has extensive experience in education cluster coordination in countries like South Sudan, Central African Republic, Pakistan. And Nicola has also experience on EIE programming, notably with UNICEF and with the Refugee Education Trust. And finally, we are delighted to have with us today Charlotte Berquin, who has been heading the education unit of UNHCR in West and Central Africa since 2018, where she works notably on the inclusion of displaced children and youth into national education systems and overseas. And Charlotte has extensive experience in education, humanitarian response, and community-based protection for children and youth. So before we move on to the heart of our matter, so on systems learning, just a few words on how throughout this webinar, you can actively participate. For those of you who participated in webinar 1 and 2, you're now familiar with the Padlet, which is our online discussion space where you can post in real time your questions, your reflections, your thoughts, and you can access this online space through your computer or your mobile phone. So for those of you who are not familiar with this Padlet, I'm just going to briefly explain how you can use that to share your reflections. First, so if you click on the link, or if you scan the QR code, you have the choice between these two options. You will end up in our kind of Padlet wall. And you can click on the plus sign, which is under the column heading here on the left side, to add a comment. Then you will see that a box will pop up. And in the heading, you can add your name, if you will, or your country or your organization. And in the text below, you can add your comments or your question or your reflection, anything that comes to mind as you are listening to our panelists. And then you simply click on Publish in the top right corner, and then you will see that it automatically appears in the Padlet wall. So we really look forward to all your contributions throughout these discussions. Okay, so a very brief introduction from my side on what we mean with systems learning. During webinar 1 and 2, we've explained that what we are trying to find out through this work that we are undertaking on MoE leadership is what are the opportunities for ministries of education to exercise leadership in the provision of equitable quality education for all in times of crisis. This is really the key overarching question that we are trying to address. And something that we have also explained during the first 2 webinars, a key framework that has been really helpful for us to understand MoE leadership in crisis situations has been this framework that is displayed here on your screens on endogenous systems leadership that our colleagues from the University of Bristol, SIRE, have produced and have presented during our first webinar. And in our very recent podcast, you can see the link of this podcast, and of this first webinar recording in the chat. So what does it mean? What is included as part of this framework? This issue of endogenous systems leadership involves thinking about leadership as a notion which is situated in the cultures, in the contexts, and in the realities of specific education systems. And it aims at looking at how the different levels of the national administration, so the central level, the middle tier level, the local levels, including obviously the district education officers, the teachers, students, caregivers, and so on, would interact between themselves. And beyond that, this framework suggests that there are 3 key elements that are interrelated that have to be taken into account. And these elements are system capacities, are democratizing governance, and finally systems learning. And this is really on this last bit on systems learning that we are focusing on today. So what do we precisely mean by systems learning? Systems learning means that education leadership, endogenous leadership in education would require that some key decision makers within the ministry and beyond in crisis settings can have access to context-relevant data and information. And when we say having access to context-relevant data, it does not only mean that data is collected, but that it's also analyzed, and most importantly, that it's used by decision makers across all these levels, so across central, middle tier, and local level. And this would also imply the need to empower these different administration layers, the central, middle tier, and local levels, through a contextually situated process to be able to use this information to inform decision-making in a relevant manner. And we'll hear about this issue of specifically using data from our panelists later today. That will become more concrete to you all. Then the second key notion to take into account when we discuss systems learning is the need to foster multi-stakeholder partnerships to promote some kind of collective learning. And this can be notably ensured by ensuring that central, middle tier, and school levels do speak to each other, and that information can actually flow across these levels, so both from the bottom up and the top down. These are extremely key notions that are linked to systems learning. And so it will be very important that communication, information sharing, coordination is guaranteed within these different administrative layers, but also with external partners, notably between development and humanitarian partners. And that's what we are going to discuss also later, notably during the second part of the panel discussion. But these multi-stakeholder partnerships also have to go beyond institutions themselves, and they should ensure that marginalized groups are also actively taking part in the systems learning processes. So this would involve the need to foster participation of these groups in dialogue, in action, in learning processes to ensure that these experiences of marginalized groups are actually reflected in decision-making processes. And finally, a last point, which is key to take into account when we refer to systems learning, is the notion of innovation, adaptive and relevant problem solving. So responding to crisis requires some new practices, some innovation and solutions that can often not be centrally led. And that's why we really put the emphasis on these different levels of the administrative layers. So when we mean endogenous leadership, it requires that we enhance a kind of enabling environment for innovation across the different parts of the system, notably looking at the local and the middle tier levels. So this is the key elements that we take into account when referring to systems learning, and that we will really try to further explain and explore with our panelists in the panel discussion that will follow, and of course with you all during the discussion. So I will now hand over to our 4 panelists. They will have the opportunity to share with us some very short opening statements to explain what's their general perspective on the topic and how it really relates to their work. And again, you will have the opportunity to share your reflections, your thoughts on the Padlet. The QR code is included here as a reminder for all of you. So I will now hand over to Dr. Moiza Binat-Sawar for her opening statements. Moiza.
Thank you. Thanks, Mathilde. Thanks for that introduction. Our work at ODI on education systems has investigated both existing resilience in systems, as they've been described in the opening framework, and also how this resilience is built in the aftermath of a crisis. We know that there are 3 kinds of capacities for leaders to think about and focus on for building resilience: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative. But the one of key importance to today's webinar, which is about education systems in crisis, is adaptive capacity. We see this to be broken down into 2 components. The first is coping in the first instance when a shock or a crisis hits. And then secondly, managing continuity, both during the uncertainty in crisis and also in the aftermath of crisis. So coping relies on leaders within each level in the system, working with the data they have before the onset of the crisis, and then presenting an initial response to the crisis according to the differential needs of end users within a nation, within a province, within the school system itself. But managing continuity is a part of adaptive capacity that requires response to data made available in real time during a crisis. And this data can take various forms and is not rendered any less meaningful for that. It's not always survey data. It can take the forms of rapid focus groups or key informant interviews at different levels of the system, but conducted as regularly as possible. Our research at ODI during the pandemic in documenting and analyzing the impact on schooling showed that often it took a crisis for actors within a system to recognize how well certain parts are linked or how badly some of them are delinked. So for example, we often saw excellent guidance and what was a fairly global and standard response from ministries of education to move towards remote learning. But what constituted remote learning needed to be matched by subnational and school level capacity to implement that guidance. This is not a failure in and of itself, not knowing what a system needs or not knowing what the subnational needs were when that guidance was issued. But it became a problem in some instances when information and data flowing from schools, teachers, often parents or associations did not get a response from other levels in the system. So adaptation in this case would have required a feedback loop where different levels in the system, in the education system, adjust over time to new information. And we often saw this missing in the initial year or so of the pandemic response. But I'm hoping that things did improve later on, and I hope that we get to hear from the participants in this webinar on whether and how it changed in the second year of the pandemic, for example. Back to you, Mathilde.
Thanks so much, Moiza. And indeed, yes, this highlights the importance of adaptive capacity to strengthen systems learning and ultimately to enhance MoE leadership. So now, George, I will turn to you to share your experience from the Ministry of Education in South Sudan. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Education has really been a struggle for life. In my directorate, as I've been heading planning, planning is more about data. Planning is more about translating data into policies and into strategies and into budget, and everything rely on data. But it has to rely on correct or data of quality, of high quality. But all throughout my life, yes, let me begin by I'm actually a student of IIEP. I learned more about real statistics and how to strategize and how to program. But I found that it's really very challenging in a situation like South Sudan. I found that it's all about battle, it's all about struggle, because the data we were collecting is for genuine delivery of education program. But from those who are you expected them to help you on the data is always looked at different corners. One of the corner is, what do you stand to gain from this data? Because they know the data we collect normally is for bringing back services to them. So there's that point of looking into those services. What kind of services? Is it in monetary form? Is it in food? Is it stationary? Is it what? How can we inflate the data in order for us to benefit better? That's the big question that we have been struggling for, because data that are not right normally end up with plans that will not be good. And coming up with plans that you can be able to collect the right data needs a lot of money, needs a lot of time, needs a lot of maybe commitment, and let me say, needs a lot of nationalism to collect the right data. Needs a lot of education for our people who most of them are not educated and most of them are living under poverty line. So that's the battle I have been struggling on, to have the right data, to have the right policies, to have the right strategies. But when you look into a situation like where, you collect data in unpredictable manner, because like South Sudan, which is very much prone to not only conflict, though now conflict is receding, but the climatic changes, the community, conflict, and then including even the coming back of returnees, which a good number of them are school students, and coming to where schools are destroyed, coming to where there are no teachers, and a country that has faced hyperinflation, economic deprivation. It becomes very difficult for us to plan on long term in terms of projecting and reflecting about what data are we to collect and at what time. So sometimes we are forced, or sometimes we have to receive data from the Good Samaritans, or we have to look for data from Good Samaritan, and those data cannot be verified or validated. But then, because of the situation, we really have to act in order to intervene. So these are always challenges, and we are struggling very much to come up with a right mechanism for getting the right data. Data is the challenge, because if you have the data, you can do everything that you want. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. And thanks really so much for highlighting the importance of timely data to enable enhanced leadership, but at the same time, the challenges in collecting, in validating, and in using this data for educational planning. Thanks. So now, Nicola, I will turn to you to share the insights from the cluster.
All right. Thank you very much, Mathilde, and everyone. I'll start with a few words to introduce what education clusters are. So education clusters, either at the global or country level, are mandated by what's called the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a broad membership of the most important organizations working or involved in humanitarian response. And the role of clusters is to coordinate the humanitarian response in the respective sectors, in education in our case, but I insist in strong collaboration with national authorities. And I have to say it is especially the case for education clusters, because obviously we have line ministries. That's not always the case for some of the other sectors, if we think about child protection or food security or WASH. But anyway, today we are talking about education. And in practice, ministries of education are, I would say, almost systematically, it depends on context, obviously, but almost systematically involved in the chairing, in sitting in education clusters. They are represented, and there is a close interaction between what we call the coordination team, led by various organizations, and the ministries of education. Irrespective of meetings taking place, etc., this can also take place more informally in ministries of education. Now, if we come to the type of data that education clusters are collecting, analyzing, it's mostly related to the situation of education in a given country. So education clusters do assessments on the status of education in a given country, including looking at what systems look like after a crisis or during the crisis, but most importantly, or most commonly, I would say, looking at the status of education in schools for students, for teachers, etc. Another big part of the data collected by education clusters is on what we call response monitoring. So that's linking with, as much as possible, all the education actors involved in education emergency response. And and that's maybe that's where there are some gaps because of lack of reporting by partners, and also when it comes to identification of needs analysis, that not enough is happening. Another challenge maybe that's worth reporting is sometimes the lack of information sharing within ministries of education. Of course, it depends on context, but there are, sometimes you can share information with one entity within the Ministry of Education, and that's not going broadly to all the other entities. A key component we'll be exploring in the next few hours on potential increased collaboration, I think, is the use of EMIS data, how education clusters can do more on this, but also ministries of education. On generally speaking, also we'll be looking more into the details of improved ways of exchanging information, data on common learning between humanitarian actors on MoEs. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Over.
Thanks so much, Nicola, and thanks for highlighting this need for multi-directional information sharing across actors to strengthen systems learning and MoE leadership. And that's also what we will discuss a bit later. So now we'll hear from Charlotte Berquin, who will share insights into the importance of data and information on refugee education.
Thanks a lot, Mathilde. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, on my end, I will focus my introduction, yes, as you said, on the need and importance of improving national education data for greater inclusion and visibility of the most marginalized population in crisis, refugees and other displaced persons, as their number is constantly increasing all over the world. In order to strengthen systems learning for Ministry of Education leadership in crisis situation, I think that there are two key points to consider. First, ensuring that all data relating to crisis-affected population, whether in a humanitarian crisis, a first displacement situation, or other crisis, is available, shared and used in an adequate and timely manner in planning and response, as George rightly said before me. And secondly, ensuring that the views of crisis-affected population are accurately and consistently represented to inform the response through a participatory and representative engagement. When it comes to refugee education, what data are currently available? What are the gaps and why? Very quickly. UNHCR recent data indicate that nearly half of school-age refugee children globally are out of school. But the reality is somewhat masked by underrepresentation of refugee children in national education data. Those who do enroll in national school, for example, may not be counted in the national data, either because their learning facilities are excluded from the formal education system where the data collection takes place, such as in refugee camps, for example, or due to the absence of data disaggregated by protection status, refugee status, for instance, when they are in formal school. So even when the data is collected, the lack of disaggregation by refugee status can be a barrier. Both factors lead to refugee children being uncounted and most of the time invisible in the national education data, and consequently their specific education, having their specific educational needs unheard and unmet. I think that we can and we should reflect on data availability through the 3 dimensions of education. So access, which refers to participation and inclusion. So are refugee children able to access school? Quality, referring to learning and teaching. Are refugee children learning when they are in school? And governments and environments, referring to, in refugee context, for example, to school safety and protection, and also to the actors involved of the governance of schools, which all have impacts of learning. These 3 dimensions are very important to consider if we are to ensure that relevant data and evidence in crisis settings are collected, analyzed, and used by decision makers, and that the use of such data and evidence actually translate into strategies and policies, as pointed out by George, leading to greater inclusion of marginalized population affected by crisis and forced displacement. And I think we'll have a discussion later on about how to do that.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Charlotte. And point well taken on the need to take into account the views of crisis-affected populations to really inform the response that will be led by the ministries of education through a participatory and representative engagement and way. So indeed, we'll have the opportunity to come back to that. We'll now move on to the panel discussion. And first, we are going to focus on how we can ensure that relevant data and evidence in crisis settings is collected, analyzed, used by decision makers at all levels of the ministry administration to support systems learning. And we will also focus on how we can ensure that these marginalized groups are better included in systems learning processes. So George, we will start with you. Can you tell us, as Director of Planning within the National Ministry of Education in South Sudan, about how you collect and you use crisis-related data to inform your decision-making process around crisis response? It's something that you've started to explain in your introduction, but if you can elaborate a little bit on this. Thanks, George.
Yeah, thank you very much. As a country, we really knew right up from beginning that we can do nothing without data. So if you could remember, we started data a long time ago. It's one of our oldest activity in the ministry. Yet, as I said earlier, it seems to be as if there's no improvement. But I think the challenge we faced very much was after the COVID, and then the flood, these climatic changes that affected the entire country or the entire world. So, of course, the reason why we cannot really improve faster is because of our budget. Of lately, our economic started to downslide very much, and the hyperinflations, and then government is not able to do what the government would have done. And then mainly we have to rely on development partners, on Good Samaritan. As a result, even if we have, our primary data that we collected normally is based on education census. We before call it annual education census because these data were collected annually and on broader basis, able to enable us to develop as many indicators as possible. But of lately, it becomes impossible for us really to ensure that we have annual education census. It turned out to be education census. That is still the responsibility we are taking. We also have another data that we tend to collect from the school level. And these are targeting those areas that are well stable and maybe well catered for. Because what we call a school monitoring system or school attendance monitoring system is collected at school level by the support of mobile. But the issue is also collected based on what the teacher think he or she can report to them. There are no mechanism for verification and monitoring. Most of the data we really collect on the crisis affected areas, including the floods. We collect this data from using our partners, the education cluster, who are always spread all over the country in areas that are not easily accessible by the government, and we also have another partnership with what we call state anchors. State anchors are recruited to serve and support our education offices at the state and county level, even up to PIAM level. So whenever there are some situations, we request them to assist us in collecting those data. And the government has got something known as South Sudan Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, which particularly in terms of refugees and returnees, that's their mandate. And but of course, they are all collecting data based on the household, based on the community that are moving from one area to another. So then we normally use the projection of how many school-age children are in one household. And then we use it for estimating number of school children that might have been affected by that calamity. We also collect data sometimes if something happened in terms of children were forced from their schools, because of the flood and whatsoever, and then we tend to find out where they are with the support of our partner. Then we tend to find out where they are and what they are doing there and what should be done for them. But as I said earlier, our major problem in South Sudan, which I know also maybe in some other sub-Saharan African country, is because people are willing to give data based on their interests. Like if I ask you, I need you to give me data on this, they know, am I from World Food Program? Am I from government? And why am I collecting this data? Is it because of capitation grant? Or is it because of food? Or is it because of textbooks and whatsoever? And then they tend to exaggerate. That's why it becomes very costly for us sometimes to be sending people from the national level and to instruct them to see, the situation by themselves, other than relying on what they are told, and to cross-check books like registrar, to see the daily attendance of the children, and to see the number of children who are not in school here, so that when we lobby for resources, that are enough and cost-effective for meeting the needs of those children. And of course, as I said, again, I have to repeat the same thing. This data, as we don't have system, we had wanted to deal with them systematically, but because of the budget situation, we are not able. And these data are always collected not in a timely manner, and are collected even sometimes analyzed based on the data collected are used for organizing action plan. Of course, that's what we mean. But since they are collected not on timely manner and they are collected by people whom we cannot verify, sometimes then our data continue to be of low quality. And that's what we have been struggling to really ensure that we improve. Yeah.
Thanks so much, George. You will have the opportunity to further elaborate on these different points, but I think here you are really pointing out to something crucial, which is the difficulty and yet the importance to set up a systemic approach to crisis-related data that goes beyond individual stakeholders' interests, and also to strengthen capacities at all levels to better collect, validate, use this data. And also we take into account your point related to the need to continue investing in strengthening crisis-sensitive national data systems, despite the ongoing budget restrictions. Thanks, George. I'm now turning over to you, Nicola. Could you tell us from how the cluster is contributing to systems learning, and how is accountability to IDP populations ensured? Nicola, can you hear? We can't hear you and we can't see you either.
No,
now we see.
There was a break in communication. Sorry, okay. There was a silent for half a minute. All right. Yes. So as I mentioned at the start, the role of clusters is really to intervene in crisis situations where ministries don't have much capacity to collect data, to analyze data. But everything we do is supposed to, I'm not saying it's always happening, but it's supposed to come in support of ministries of education's own work. So, of course, sometimes there are issues of impartiality, safety that we have to take into account. But as much as possible, we collaborate with national authorities by sharing information with them and trying as much as possible also if they have specific requests in certain circumstances to collect and analyze the data that they need. At the start, I mentioned some of the challenges that we have seen through for the past few years in terms of work by education clusters. One I mentioned at the start is the low number of assessments done. To give you a figure, for example, in the past 2 years, we have done more or less 12 what we call JENAs, Joint Education Needs Assessments, which are comprehensive assessments in areas affected by crisis. And that may sound large, but if we look at the more or less 30 contexts or countries where we intervene, that's only 20% of this context covered on a yearly basis. Another example of the challenges we are facing is response monitoring. Some of you may have heard of what we call the 5W. The response that's done by
I think, Nicola, you may have a connection issue. I don't know if you can still hear us. Maybe not. Okay, maybe we'll move on to Moises. Can you hear, Nicola? Are you still here? I don't think that you can still hear us. So maybe we will move on to Moises' reflections on...
You can't hear me?
No, you actually broke for a few seconds, unless it's me. So if someone else can confirm.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in the office. It's a bit strange, but anyway.
Okay, someone can confirm whether it was only me or if it was for everyone.
No, I couldn't hear him either. And okay. I wonder if Nicola can kill his video. It might help with the...
Yeah, let's try that.
Sure. I'm supposed to have a broadband, high quality one, but nevertheless, okay, let's try that. So I was flagging, how basically cluster systems on ministry systems on ways of working, do not always match. On that the two platforms, so to say, are built in very different ways. Typically, the clusters are driven by what we call the emergency coordination teams on OCHA's requests, with extremely short deadlines, sometimes 1 day or a few days, whereas ministries obviously work on the longer term. However, we are working on improving the situation with countries. For example, we are trying to develop globally, but to be implemented in every country, 3 to 4 key indicators to be included in all countries' 5Ws. And this should help us develop better dashboards, better understanding of the response situation globally under the country level. And that should be contributing to ministries' own understanding of, you mentioned partners' contribution to the response. And we are also doing a lot of work on capacity building, not only of humanitarian partners, but ministries of education staff on needs assessments. We'll conduct, from the global level, we'll support 10 needs assessments, comprehensive needs assessments in the next 18 months on. Again, ministries of education are systematically invited on participating in these initiatives, not only for steering the discussion, identifying information needs and objectives, but also sometimes contributing to data collection on analysis. Maybe, Mathilde, at the start also, you're looking at the different levels in a given country within ministries of education, how we can work together on this. And I have to say that from a cluster's perspective, maybe that's where things are the least structured, but maybe where we are providing the most help. as the one described by George, where we have a...
I think, Nicola, your connection broke again. So we'll move on to you, Moisa, now, because I don't think that I can hear Nicola anymore. So Moisa, sorry, Nicola, we will move on because your connection seems to be a little bit problematic.
Okay.
Moisa, can you tell us what are your key reflections on how data is used and how this use of data can support systems learning?
Great, thanks, Mathilde. So, I mean, George already pointed it out, as has Nicola. There are very many good reasons for having baseline disaggregated data in advance of a crisis, so that when you're planning or in the midst of one, leaders and responders don't misjudge what the starting point is in different localities, in different school districts, and also for different populations of school-going children, and to understand exactly where they are in the education pathway before this interruption came on. So regular data collection efforts in non-crisis times does obviously help prevent flying blind when a crisis does hit. But there are other barriers to the use of data that are not about the lack of data per se. Often education stakeholders across the system have data, but they don't have the appetite to use it, or the political space to use it, or sometimes the technical skills to use it. And this is partly because they already have other methods of making decisions. Our research has shown that decision makers often rely and trust a certain set of relationships or a certain set of people, and it's from there that they get the information when they want to make a decision. There are also issues around how data is framed. It's not user-friendly, and when I mean user, I don't mean just for a lay person, but user-friendly in the sense of speaking to the technical skills that the decision makers have at that different level. And at times, those who do have the data, who have been working on collection, and who have made the effort to frame it accessibly, don't have access to the policymakers or the decision makers at the right time, because data uptake rests on policymakers reaching out for information rather than the other way around. So the initiation often comes from decision makers. So we know that in the past few years and over the last decade, in fact, the generation of data is improving, as well as the amount of data that's available. But it's not clear to us in research whether the political incentives to use that data are always present. And while our research currently is able to say more about what kind of drives uptake by decision makers in non-crisis settings, we don't really know that much about what drives uptake of existing data by system leaders during a crisis. And of course, this kind of gap around knowledge is key to thinking about how systems learn and become stronger. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Moisa, for these important reflections about the barriers to use data and how this can actually prevent systems learning if it's not properly addressed. It's something that we can also discuss with participants during the discussions later. Now I am going to turn to you, Charlotte, because UNHCR has been working extensively with government on inclusion of refugees within national education systems. So it would be interesting to hear from you what are the implications of including refugees in terms of collecting, analyzing, and using this data for ministries of education.
Yeah, so the inclusion of refugees in national education systems is a long-term, multi-stage process that involves many interrelated aspects of the three dimensions of education that I mentioned before: access, quality, and governance. For inclusion to be effective and sustainable, education systems must be prepared to integrate refugees and equipped to meet their specific needs. This implies that planners and decision makers in Ministry of Education must have at their disposal the relevant data and evidence to plan and organize this inclusion. But collecting data on refugee and collecting refugee education data is complex. A recent joint report by the UNESCO Institute for Statistics and UNHCR, I'll put the link in the chat after, highlights the plight of refugee children globally and acknowledges their invisibility and underrepresentation in education data, as I also mentioned in the introduction, due to several challenges. The first main challenge is the absence of disaggregation by refugee status or adequate proxies in context where refugee children attend national schools and are included in national data collection processes and tools, such as EMIS, for example. But this is linked to two other challenges: the identification of refugee, where distinguishing between refugees and non-refugees can be difficult, and the protection risks associated with identifying refugee children and disaggregating data by refugee status, especially in contexts where refugees may be under threat. Indeed, in such situation, although confidentiality and data protection should be a priority, and data should be chosen with care, this may hinder the identification of the specific needs of refugees. The second main challenge is an overly narrow emphasis on access to education in refugee education data, which excludes other education dimensions such as learning and protection, with the result that even if refugee children are attending school, we know very little about their education experiences, which makes it difficult to plan adequately for the particular support they need to stay and progress in school. And the third main challenge is the fragmental and weak coordination on refugee education data that may lead to duplication of data, lack of data sharing agreement, and an unclear pathway towards ensuring refugee access to quality and safe education. I'll finish on that. Understanding the needs of refugees requires disaggregated education data and leveraging existing data collection efforts and procedures, so both. This can be done, and this should be done under the leadership of Ministry of Education by prioritizing the safe identification of refugees within existing data collection tools such as EMIS or other evaluation, PISA, for example, with specific questions on refugee status in line with protection recommendation. And this is urgently needed in contexts where refugees are included in national education systems, but are not identified in data systems, limiting the possibility of addressing their unique learning needs. So further disaggregating refugee education by age, gender, and disability status can also promote a better understanding of their specific needs and nuances of access, learning, and safety. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks for sharing these insights regarding the representation of refugees in education data and how improving such representation could ultimately strengthen systems learning on MoE leadership in crisis settings. So we'll now move on to the second part of this panel discussion that focuses on the second point that I explained when I presented the key dimensions of systems learning. And this second point focuses on partnerships and collective learning. So we often state that multi-stakeholder partnerships are really essential for effective crisis response. And so here, what we will try to find out is how we can promote collective learning across these partnerships to support Ministry of Education leadership in crisis settings. I don't know if Nicola is back. Nicola, can you hear us? Are you back? Maybe not. So in this case, Moisa, we will start with you. And the question that we would have for you is that we often tend to think about partnerships as occurring between government and humanitarian partners. So from your perspective, could you give us a concrete example of partnerships with civil society that goes beyond these more traditional partnerships, including how this has involved the use of citizen-generated data and how, in turn, this could enhance MoE leadership in crisis settings?
Sure. Thanks, Mathilde. I think my sense is most people in the audience today will have heard of the two kind of most spoken about, renowned examples of citizen-generated data in education, which is ZOEZO in the East African region, operating in different countries there, and ACER in India, where researchers and data gatherers get information on learning and education systems at a fairly granular level. In crisis settings, though, this is different. In the first instance, it depends on the scale and the nature of the crisis. So a natural disaster versus a civil war versus an epidemic, pandemic, or a protracted conflict leads to differing environments that affect how data can be collected, both for tracking the impact of the crisis and also for the efficacy of any initial response. And our work during the pandemic kind of showed that clearly. In particular, I'm thinking about the work we at ODI did as part of the EdTech Hub, as well as another data collection effort I was part of in Yemen. And the practice of data collection is different because the risks that data collectors face on ground are very different. And in some of these settings, ministry level functioning is severely compromised for protracted periods, so this can vary and can occur more cyclically. So in these situations, citizens often double hat as researchers and data gatherers. And with the pandemic, we saw that data collection organizations, both within a country as well as international data collection organizations, were able to move fairly successfully to both training and developing research tools by remotely working with interested citizens and residents in these areas and in subnational districts. And in this way, organizations attempted to also provide opportunities for using existing skills amongst local residents and citizens, or providing and upskilling where residents were interested. And ensuring that a lack of resources was not one of the reasons why the flow of information wasn't going from one level of the system to another. And in some cases, we were able to see that local experiences were not drowned out, and nor local capacities where they were able to be successfully documented and advocated for, were not ignored in the usual flurry of emergency and quick response that can often be launched by international actors, and tends to come often with a global method of responding to crisis. But an important thing to note here is that within crisis settings, the safety of data collectors is a key consideration. In some cases where we were working, while residents were able to collect data, they asked to remain anonymous. In other regions, asking questions itself was fairly dangerous in certain points, and data was more likely to be anecdotal. And we had to devise and think about ways in how this citizen-generated data could be triangulated to be considered a little bit more robust. Either way, thinking about citizen-generated data in or outside a crisis needs to hold protection principles of citizens and residents as the beginning point of developing any protocol for research. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Moisa. You actually shed light on a very important point regarding citizen-generated data and how this can be better tapped into to promote bottom-up accountability to local communities and to create this kind of enabling environment that we were referring to at the beginning of this session for local decision-making, innovation, and so on and so forth. And you also rightly warning us about the protection concerns that this may trigger. And actually, this would echo well with the points made by Charlotte. So on the need to include the voices and experiences of refugees, but keeping in mind protection issues. So Charlotte, turning to you, could you share examples of these enlightening partnerships and when UNHCR has worked closely with ministries of education and other partners to include these perspectives of refugee population in the education response, and how this can improve systems learning in crisis settings?
Yes, thanks, Mathilde. So first of all, UNHCR according to its capacities, is most of the time present in the national education coordination bodies, both in the education cluster, which has been described by Nicola, and in the local education groups, in order to inform at all times the Ministry of Education and the other actors of the sectors of the situation and needs of the forcibly displaced person in the country, in order to encourage their consideration in the planning and in the response. For example, to give you a very concrete example, when the Central African Republic recently developed its education sector plan, UNHCR supported the Ministry of Education to have the necessary data and elements to be able to take into account the many Central African refugees from neighboring asylum countries who had recently been repatriated to their country, to Central African Republic. This obviously involves not only a process of sharing quantitative data, but also ensuring that the specific needs and concerns of this population, and also the skills and resources that they have, which are identified, for example, through UNHCR regular participatory assessments or protection monitoring, are reflected and contribute to improve system learning. In Chad, which has been hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees from Sudan, Central African Republic, and Nigeria, among others, for many years, is another example where continued collaboration between the Ministry of Education and UNHCR has helped to adapt the system and improve its responsiveness to the needs of refugee children and youth. The Ministry of Education in Chad has nationalized all the schools that have been built by UNHCR and its partner in the refugee camps, and for several years has regularly and systematically included data on school enrollment, learning condition, protection and safety at school, and the success of refugees in national examination. This allowed to use this data to effectively and visibly integrate refugees into response planning and to have dedicated performance indicators to monitor and evaluate progress towards established targets. To go further and to ensure refugee representation in school governance bodies and to include the refugee perspective in the response, Chad has also allowed refugee teachers to access Teacher Training Institute, enabling them to acquire a national diploma, but also to have their voices heard and to be recognized as full stakeholder in the response. There are just a few examples, but they show that it is essential to encourage greater coordination of refugee education data collection, management, and sharing. And a last example, I think that existing mechanisms, such as, for example, the IIEP Data Reference Group on Education in Emergency, co-chaired by OIS and ECW, can serve as example of platforms to coordinate and galvanize the efforts of various stakeholders to improve, standardize, and share existing data and knowledge on crisis-affected population. Over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for pointing out this need to draw lessons learned from existing partnerships. That's very important. We are running a little bit behind, so I'm going to quickly hand over to you, George. Could you give us some examples of partnerships in South Sudan that have been particularly beneficial in terms of making informed decisions for the Ministry of Education? Over to you. You're on mute, George. We can't hear you. If you can just unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you again. Yeah. You know, when our economy was good that time, we were a bit relaxed, but suddenly it turned out that almost 70% of our education funding comes from partners, even if in this year there's improvement where government has increased the funding, but yet that enables us really to say, look, if you don't work together and work closely with your partners, you will never achieve your targets and your goals in education. So in that time, we created something not as flagship. Flagships are big funding that has to support the system. One of the examples is GPE, and GPE strategies help us a lot to come together with partners. And again, the other one is the Just Education for South Sudan, funded by UK. It also helped to bring some partners together so that we can work together. But of recently, when the school closed, we found ourselves all drawn together because the effect of the closing of schools are of more negative to us than positive. Many children, even up to today, as I'm speaking, many youth are now refusing to go back to the formal system of education, and girls are pregnant. So all the partners together with the National Education Coalition, these are the civil societies, come together and say, no, we have to open the schools. We have to open the schools. Then I could see we begin sitting regularly to talk about how to open the schools, beginning from school cleaning, schools, organization, and whatsoever. We all work together. And the most interesting thing is that you find that immediately partners started to say, I can support this activity. I can support this activity. Then eventually we decided to reopen the schools. After reopening the schools, the same partners continued, where instead of meeting, like when we are discussing issues related to girls' education, we only sit with guests. Now we sit together in partnership. All those partners that before, during the time of closure of schools were there, we continue to sit together. So we realized that work is becoming a bit easier for us because through this consultation, through these collective agreements, it makes things easier for us, both in the areas of financing and in the areas of action. Now, the new system system capacity grants for GPA is informing us that we should come up with partnership compact. And I think that's a very good ground that has already been laid for this partnership compact. And we are working towards ensuring that we really strengthen our partnership. So in summary, we are expanding our partnership from individual before, like cluster, like state anchors, to broader, that brings together the civil societies under the umbrella of National Education Coalition to ad hoc, these are the donor group, and then to UN agencies, including UNESCO, where I'm sitting in its office. So it's still a work in progress.
Thanks so much, George, for pointing out to this collective learning process and decision making. We are running out of time, but we will still ask each of the panelists to share final remarks on your key priorities for ministries of education and their partners to improve systems learning. And we will ask you to be very short and concise. So we will give you 1 minute each. And George, we will start with you. If you can share your top priorities to improve systems learning from an MoE perspective. You are on mute, George. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, yeah. Our priority in terms of, galvanizing the challenges we are getting in education is real about having the data of quality, because once we have the data of high quality, we'll be able to come up with the strategies that are acceptable. Since now we have agreed to work together, once you have a collaborative, plan that you develop together, it's not difficult to finance that plan. And, as a government of South Sudan, our major challenge right up from beginning is the issue of the teacher. Without teacher, there's no success. And all our teachers during the COVID period have left the job. And hyperinflation has reduced, the food on their table. So education is merely run by volunteers. So our minister said, we have to fight very, very hard to improve the teaching, services. So our priority is real to have data quality in order to develop good strategies so that we can be able to mobilize funding in order to support the teacher and ensure that teachers are there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George, for pointing out to the crucial role of teachers and ensuring that information can flow bottom up. now I'm going to move on to Charlotte for your final remarks. Unfortunately, Nicola cannot join us because there seems to be an office-wide internet outage. So we'll see if he can join later. But Charlotte, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Mathilde. I'll be quick. So I think there are three critical points we can highlight and that apply to all crisis situations. First, we need to ensure that crisis-sensitive planning is systematically strengthened in all contexts to improve the speed and quality of crisis response without leaving anyone behind, including refugees. Secondly, ensure that lessons learned from past crises are integrated and used to improve planning, including by taking into account the perspective of all affected population. And finally, improve coordination between the different actors under the leadership of the Ministry of Education so that all available data and quality data informs planning and response while ensuring representation and participation of affected population throughout the planning cycle. I will just close saying that for refugees, the use of an identification and disaggregation approach is critical to developing better responses to their specific educational needs and to move beyond only measuring access to education to measuring effective learning, quality of school environment, as well as protection and safety. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And that's, yes, a very essential point to try and ensure that we draw lessons from the past crises to enhance systems learning. And thanks also for reiterating this point on the need to enhance participation of affected populations in decision-making processes. And finally, we'll move on to you, Moisa, for your final remarks in 1 minute.
Great. Thanks so much. I think I just wanted to pick a little bit on what George said, which was, articulating a clear need of what's happening in a crisis, that there are teachers who've stepped out and there are volunteers who are stepping in. So I think, that's kind of a beginning point for ministries of education in terms of responding in a way that prioritizes voices within local school systems. So why have teachers stepped out? What can be done to get qualified teachers back? How can volunteers who are stepping in be supported? So that, there's clearly information and how systems are responding to it would be very interesting to see. And I think it serves as kind of strengthening that system learning. For my second kind of recommendation would be for partners, international partners in particular, that a plea towards them to ensure that they support local citizens and residents in collecting data where it can be done safely. And then in the first instance in a crisis, looking at what are the local adaptive and resilient capacities, and to ensure that those, if they're working and people consider them to be of value, that they're not wiped out in favor of a top-down model of crisis response. And finally, also for those interested in research, please invest in knowledge on the uptake of evidence in education systems by ministries of education and other system leaders, rather than only the generation of evidence. So thanks, Mathilde.
Thanks so much, Moisa. Thanks for highlighting this need to really favor local adaptive capacities to foster a bottom-up approach, which we also referred to at the beginning of this webinar. So unless Nicola is back, and Nicola, if you are back, feel free to take the floor, but I don't see you. No, I don't think he's back. So thanks so much for all three of you, and thanks also to Nicola. That's now the end of this first half of the webinar. And as I was mentioning before, for the second half, we will move on to group discussions. These groups will be moderated by IIEP colleagues, and that will really be the opportunity to share all your thoughts, your questions, your ideas about systems learning and MoE leadership in crisis settings. So for those of you who are not able to join the breakout groups, please log off now. And for those of you who can participate and who wish to participate, stay with us. You will be transferred to your respective breakout rooms in a minute. And then you can take a very short break for 2-3 minutes just to allow for the time to transfer everyone in their respective rooms. For those of you leaving us, importantly, we would be grateful if you could please fill in the post-webinar survey that will pop up when you leave this meeting. That's quite important for us to strengthen our learning out of these experiences. So thanks, everyone. And we are now going to transfer into the breakout rooms. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So now we have approximately 6 minutes left. So we'll ask each speaker who has participated as a resource person to report back with one sentence, because we don't have a lot of time, capturing their impression of the discussion or what they are keen to think about in addition to what has been explored in the group work. Can we start with you, Moisa, for instance?
Sure. I think there was a really excellent point made about the fact that during crises, and particularly during the pandemic, we saw a lot of innovation and a lot of solutions happening at the local level of school leaders, and a lot of what you would call is the adaptive capacity increasing and improving. And the discussion was more about how do we make sure that this is transferred or it has an institutional memory. And we came to the conclusion to some degree, or there was one comment about it to some degree, that this depends on the demand. And we have to look at what drives the demand for this kind of evidence, or the kind of demand that says, we want to know what worked and how to ensure that happened. I think if I had to pick one point, it would be there. A lot of other good points were also made. Thanks, Mathilde.
Thanks so much, Moisa. Actually, it resonates with what we've discussed ourselves in our group. So I'm now going to turn to Nicola, if you are here, to summarize in one sentence.
Yes, can you hear me now? All right. Yeah. Sorry, I had there was a big internet outage in the office, but anyway, I was able to join the group, I think, in the second half. But in a few words, indeed, what an example that was brought that I felt was very practical on implementable is the contribution to emissions. Both you mentioned actors being able to integrate emis indicators in their data collection analysis efforts, on vice versa also maybe trying to be ministries of education trying to integrate education emergency indicators in their emis work. There were a few questions, sorry, I'm going back to my notes. Yes, maybe 2 or 3 key points on consistent engaging in consistent collection of data, stressing that there are little points in doing comprehensive exercises in data collection if it's not conducted over several years that we can compare. We have solid baselines that can be used by everyone for programming. Obviously, the issue of reliability of data that's collected as well. On one link to that with the link with the Ministry of Education is a perceived reliability of data. That by trying to do things together as different, you mentioned, stakeholders, ministries of education, the data is going to be perceived as reliable on taken into account. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicola. Seems like you've also had very interesting and rich discussions around emis systems, notably. So, Charlotte, are you with us?
Yeah, thanks, Mathilde. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So also a lot of interesting point in our group, but our group discussion mainly highlighted that the current challenges of education require dynamic, inclusive, and participatory approaches, as well as adequate resources for data collection and sharing. And the point on resources was largely discussed. I will not share everything here, but it was really an important point. As in other groups, participants also highlighted the role of emis in crisis and how it could be a great source of especially baseline disaggregated data in advance of a crisis and extremely useful for planning. Another point related to the essential need to involve teachers and to build robust teacher training systems that provide teachers with sufficient tools to improve their own teaching system. And finally, I think we all recognize the need to find solutions in a collegial manner to regularly exchange data and evidence on crisis-affected learners, jointly assess the data gaps, and look for flexible solutions allowing to improve the availability and quality of data to address the needs of all learners, including the most marginalized.
Thank you, Charlotte, for sharing these points. And indeed, this issue of teachers as central stakeholders in systems learning processes seems to be recurrent, and that's really a key element that we've discussed as well. So, George, if you are with us.
Yeah, I think what come out was clearly about, top-bottom approach. The government or stakeholders have to be listeners because, at the bottom level, we all agree that, there are best practices there are experience there. So we should not be like enforcing all the time. We have to learn from them. And then the other thing that stood out is about the quality of data, integration of data, because we know that without data, no work can be done. So that is very, very important. And also we said on the planning, we have to be dynamic. We have to come up with the dynamic planning based on what is real on the ground in the time of crisis. And that we also have to balance, all the approach between, humanitarian intervention and education, because education is really key to even getting rid of this crisis. Because once you are learned, it becomes very difficult to get into crisis. So I think these are some of the points you mentioned.
Thank you, George, and thank you for pointing out the need to kind of move away from the centrally dominated decision-making processes. That's also something that we've discussed in our group. And so to finish with our last group, so indeed we discussed this need to grasp better the perspectives of these key stakeholders that I was referring to earlier, the teachers and the students themselves, and to emphasize what solutions do work from the perspectives of these stakeholders to allow for more contextually relevant decision-making processes and planning. And we've heard great experiences from ministries of education, notably during COVID-19 response. We've also alluded to this need for demand-driven data. I guess that's something that came up across the different groups to really improve systems learning. So I think we have reached the end of this webinar. I would like to end by really thanking all our great panelists, resource persons, and of course participants for your very rich inputs, these great exchanges that we've managed to have. We've really had insightful discussions thanks to all your contributions, both in the group discussions and in the Padlet. So we will share the Padlet reflections and the insights following the event. And if you want to know more about endogenous systems leadership, if you want to think a little bit further, please do listen to our podcast that has been made with our colleagues Anna Seeger and Stephanie Bengtson and our colleagues from the University of Bristol, Surrey. And of course, visit our website to learn more about our work on crisis-sensitive planning and MoE leadership. So thanks again to all. And yes, before I forget, we would be extremely grateful if when you leave this meeting, you could fill in the post-webinar survey that will pop up. Thanks again to all of you and have a great rest of the day.